Hello, this is the next chapter from the White Merle by Lilian Gask. Chapter the 9th, A Land of Danger. The branches of the great trees were thickly interlaced, and even the morning sunlight found it difficult to pierce their canopy of leaves. Conrad slept on so late that Gladheart was tempted to leave him for a few moments in the care of the fairy bluebird, who promised to guard him carefully and to twitter loudly if she saw cause for alarm. "I shall not go far," said the little fellow earnestly, "but I must find some berries for him. He will be hungry when he wakes." Now, the fairy bluebird quite intended to keep her word, but the robin had no sooner flown away than she heard her mate impatiently calling her. Although an amiable bird, he had his weaknesses, and strongly objected to being kept waiting. "Won't you coming?" he chirped irritably. "You're watching the boy bird while he's asleep." "Well, I wish you wouldn't. It gives you quite enough to do to watch me. What else were you made for, I should like to know?" The fairy bluebird ruffled her feathers and looked distressed. What would Gladheart think of her when he returned and found that she had deserted her post? Still, she had no wish to vex her mate, and when once again she heard his call, "Are you coming?" she flew off. So, when a queer and ugly animal covered with thick reddish-brown hair came leisurely through the tangled trees, swinging himself from branch to branch with his hairy arms and showing his yellow teeth in a horrible grin which frightened every bird that saw it, Conrad was quite alone. The orang-outang had been watching his opportunity, dropped lightly on the ground beside him. He was the strongest animal in the forest. How dared this creature, half boy, half bird, come trespassing on his domain? He was asleep now, and before he had time to wake and struggle, he would break those wings of his so that he could not fly. Then he would carry him off to his hiding place in the dank undergrowth, where, night by night, in different places, he made himself a nest or hut of broken boughs laid between the forked branches of a low tree. Conrad was dreaming of Barney. It was always Barney or his father that he dreamed of, when it was not the White Merle. This time Barney's eyes seemed to be red instead of yellow. They shone like the danger signals of a railway train, and Conrad was so amazed to find them growing larger and larger that he opened his own eyes wide. Barney vanished, and in his place was an enormous ape with a huge black face and sullen, lowering brows. Conrad was too startled to speak, and lay quite still, so still that the orang did not seize him at once, as he had intended, but turned his head to see why the twigs behind him should snap when there was no one there. As he did so, his expression changed from malignant hatred to deadly fear. Dark forms, the colour of himself, but with shining skin instead of shaggy hair, were stealing through the undergrowth, armed with the long brown fire sticks that he had learnt to dread. He had no thought of Conrad now, but, snatching the branches with his great hands, he disappeared amongst the trees again. The natives, jabbering to each other in great excitement, hurried further into the jungle. Fortunately for Conrad, his soft brown wings and feathery tunic blended with the colour of the ground, and his face was hidden. He had turned it away in dread of what might happen next. There was nothing to betray his presence. When the Malays were well out of sight, a distant shot and a loud, sharp cry of pain showed how swiftly punishment had followed the evil intentions of the orang-outang. Conrad ventured to sit up. A splendid butterfly, fluttering over a curious green orchid with crimson spots, congratulated him on his escape. The upper surface of his wings was a beautiful purple, tinged with ash colour, and the broad bar of orange that crossed their centre was extremely handsome. "Nature has been kind to us both," he murmured, in a low-toned voice that Conrad could hardly hear. "Your wings are the colour of dried leaves and grass, and so are mine when I close them. See." He shut them quickly and looked so like a withered leaf attached to a twig that Conrad could scarcely believe he was a butterfly. The delicate veining of a darker shade was clearly marked, just as it is on leaves, and the soft dun colour of the undersurface of his wings was flecked with brown and green. Conrad had heard of protective resemblance before, but he had never understood what it quite meant until now. He was still watching the butterfly when Gladheart returned. "I found a most wonderful fruit tree, the durian," the robin twittered joyfully. "It is something like one of our elms to look at, but taller still and with smoother bark. The fruit is green and as large as your head. Its rind is so thick and leathery that I cannot even dent it with my beak. But the birds tell me that inside of it is full of soft cream-coloured pulp. Wouldn't you like to try it?" Conrad thought he would, but the rind of the fruit proved to be so tough that he had to leave it. His leathery tunic had no pockets, and when, after much trouble, he succeeded in getting at those in his knickerbockers, he found that he had left his knife at home. So he had to content himself with more wild strawberries, and as he ate them he told the robin about the orang-outan. Gladheart could not blame himself enough for having left him, and cancelled instant flight away. "There's a long narrow island not far away," he said, "that is supposed to be one of the loveliest in the world. It has fiery mountains which are as high as Fujisan, and ferns and palms such as you find in no other country. It is called Java, and the barbet I met just now told me that it belonged to people who came from Holland. She said that some of the birds were far more splendid even than the Argus pheasant. Let us go and see." "Very well," said Conrad prudently, making no remark on the tigers he knew would be found there also. He felt ready for any adventure now, and it gave him a thrill of pleasure to think that he would soon be treading the very ground that his father had trod long ago. No mountain would ever seem to him so beautiful as Fujisan, but Conrad thought that her fire sisters in Java were almost lovely enough to be her rivals. Clusters of exquisite ferns, luxuriating in the warm, moist heat of the island, feathered their very summits, while stately forests spread along their slopes. Hundreds of birds and butterflies and insects made their home here, but it was the hottest part of the day just now, and most of them were dozing away the hours. Conrad had spent some time in strolling through a grove of palm trees before any of the birds appeared to notice him.
"Why are you wandering about at this hour, instead of waiting till it grows cooler?"
asked a sleepy voice at last, and a bright green jungle fowl with an elegant purple comb and a very gay wattle of yellow and green and blue strutted out from behind a bush and stared at him quizzically. "I'm looking for the White Merle," said Conrad.
"Oh, white isn't a popular colour here,"
remarked the jungle fowl, trying to crane his neck so that he might see the glistening bronze-green feathers of his own back.
"But you might ask my cousin Bakiko. He has a very inquiring mind, and finds out most things. I mind my own business and gives me enough to do."
Bakiko was very like the gamecock of England, with his comb and wattles were a brilliant scarlet. His plumage varied from ruddy chestnut to deep blue-black and orange-red, and his eyes were full of fire. He was very unlike the everyday cocks and hens of home, of which his family was supposed to be the ancestors.
"Everyone's asleep just now,"
Bakiko remarked abruptly, speaking in a quick, sharp voice very different from the drawl of his grand cousin.
"If your precious White Merle is to be found in Java, you won't see anything of her till later in the day. And as you are here, you may well look round. One picks up a beetle or two, when one at least expects it."
Conrad passed some very pleasant hours in exploring the forest, and Bakiko gave him much curious information that he had gathered from various sources.
"Here is something that will surprise you,"
he said mysteriously, as he turned a corner of the winding path. In the shade of some enormous trees stood a ruined building of massive stone, some 30 feet square by 20 feet high, and on its sides were boldly sculptured figures of animals and men. Bakiko perched himself on a projecting block and flapped his wings. He seemed as if he were going to crow, but gave his sharp cry instead.
"This was built hundreds and hundreds of years ago,"
he said, looking down at Conrad impressively.
"The night wind says that it was the burial place of kings who were mighty warriors. There are many such ruins all over Java, tombs and temples and terraced palaces with figures hewn out of solid rock. But I see you are thinking still of your White Merle. Wait here for a while, and I will go to try and bring you news of her."
So Conrad rested by the stone ruin, and dozed as the birds did until the heat of the day had waned, and a refreshing breeze blew in from the sea. Bakiko came back then. He was rather dishevelled, for he had been fighting a jungle fowl that had annoyed him, and was still smarting under the indignity of being flouted by a hen.
"I can hear nothing of your White Merle," he said to Conrad. "You had better ask the peacock about her. He is supposed to be the king here."
With some brief directions as to where the peacock would be found, he darted off to give his rival another lesson. The forest was stirring now, and Conrad stopped from time to time to make inquiries of hornbills and woodpeckers and sweet little lorikeets, but none of these could help him. He was growing disheartened when he reached the wide thickets of bamboo where the king of the peacocks held his court. A most magnificent bird, he was of noble size, and the extended feathers of his upper tail coverts formed the dazzling fan that had made him famous. He spread them now for his visitors' admiration, and every colour imaginable played in the spear-shaped ends. The upright feathers of his crest were shot with golden green, while the refulgent blue of his splendid head merged from his throat into vivid tints of emerald. The lowly and sober-hued peahens, several of which were his own particular property, gazed at him with adoring eyes. He introduced them with a careless gesture of indifference.
"They are not bad hens," he said, "though of course they are very dowdy. Each lays from 12 to 15 eggs. They hatch them in November."
"Why are the young birds born in winter?" asked Conrad thoughtlessly. As soon as he had spoken, he remembered that these islands were on the opposite side of the world to England, and that November would really mean the early summer here. The scorn with which the peacock looked at him made him feel very small.
"Winter?"
His Majesty repeated.
"We have no winter. There is a dry season and a rainy one. What more can one want? Where is my nest? You had better ask my hens. Perhaps they will show you one still standing."
A particularly meek little peahen, whose only claim to comeliness lay in a band of green across her throat, detached herself from her family and modestly offered to take him to her own. The king of the peacocks, who was far too conscious of his magnificence to know the meaning of jealousy, spread his tail again, proud to display his hues as they glowed in the sunshine. The peahen ran to a low bank where a roughly constructed heap of sticks and feathers remained to show where she had hatched her eggs.
"We build on the ground," she said, "though we roost high up in the trees, where we are out of the way of tigers and wild cats, who would harry us if they could. The natives kill us when our flesh is tender, but when the dry season comes and we can feed only on leaves and insects, they leave us alone, unless they want the radiant plumage of our kings."
A loud hoarse cry came from a peacock some 20 yards away and was answered rapidly by every bird within hearing distance. Uttering a series of quick, sharp notes, they all flew into the trees, leaving Conrad standing alone in the plantation. "What's the matter?" he asked, and as he spoke came face to face with a snarling tiger.
"Hey!"
cried Gladheart, twittering desperately, but Conrad's wings were weighted as if with lead, and the tiger was ready to spring.
"Duck!"
shrieked the peacocks with one accord, and Conrad had the presence of mind to do this as the tiger leapt. The snarling brute went over his head, and before he had time to leap once more, Conrad had found the use of his wings again and was soaring high above him. Gladheart gave him no peace that night until he had found a perch on the topmost branch of a tall tree, where the wind soon rocked him to sleep. With the first rays of morning, the robin entreated him to leave Java. The sight of the tiger had quite upset him, and he trembled at the rustle of a leaf.
"This is the land of danger, and there is no chance of finding the White Merle here," he assured Conrad earnestly. "The night wind laughed when I asked her, but on a large island not far away, I think they call it Borneo, there are deep caves by the seashore in which strange birds build nests as clear as crystal. Might not these be a colony of white merles who have fled to the caves for safety?"
It was a forlorn hope, but Conrad did not like to damp his little companion's ardour, and so agreed that they should start at once. A sunbird declared that no white merle had found her way to Java, and Conrad paused for a moment to watch him as he clung to the stem of a flower, seeking for small insects lurking in its petals with his long tongue. From his soft grey breast shone 2 little tufts of gold, glistening as he moved. Each way he turned he showed fresh beauties. The sea was calm today, and as he skimmed the air above it, Conrad watched the fleeting shadows of the clouds. The sands were a mist of gold, and as he reached the shores of Borneo and its rough-hewn cliffs, looked as if they were guarding secrets. He made at once for the cavern where Gladheart hoped to find the colony of white merles. After the glare of the light outside, the lofty caves were as black as night, and it was some minutes before Conrad's eyes became sufficiently accustomed to the gloom for him to distinguish the birds that flitted beneath the lofty roof. Alas for the robin's hopes! They were only white on the underparts of their bodies. The rest of their plumage was very dark, except for their tails, which were of the palest grey. Conrad scarcely needed to hear their cry to know that they were members of the Swift family, but he was far too interested in what they were saying to be much disappointed at this.
"The night wind vows that they are planning to steal our nests again,"
one bird cried plaintively.
"When will they give us a chance to lay our eggs?"
"It is barely 2 moons since they took our last nest," wailed his mate, and a chorus of distressed twitterings from the other swiftlets told the same sad tale. Conrad lifted his wings very gently so that he might not alarm them, and rose to a height of nearly 100 feet from the ground. Here a long row of nests was stretched against the wall. They seemed to him less like nests than pockets. Some were pearly white with a lining of soft feathers, others were lightest amber. The swiftlets greeted him with such shrill cries that it was not easy to make them understand that he was a friend and not some terrible bird of prey intending to molest them.
I'm glad to hear it," said an elder swiftlet thankfully, his bright eyes shining through the dusk. "It is a terrible shock to us to be disturbed. Hark! What was that? I believe it is as the night wind said."
Conrad barely had time to flatten himself against the wall at the far end of the cavern when a party of half-naked men with reddish skins made their way in noisily, carrying torches and ladders and very long sticks tipped with pieces of iron. The swiftlets, poor things, knew what was going to happen and fled despairingly. Fixing their ladders against the wall, and this was no easy matter, for the ground sometimes to the depths of many feet was covered with slimy masses formed from the droppings of the birds, the Malays climbed up them and ruthlessly tore at the swiftlets' nests. The light of the torches fell on their glistening thread-like meshes as they were placed in linen bags, the whitest and most transparent being separated from the rest. When all had been collected and the wall was bare, the men dismounted. They were ready now to rifle another cave. On his way out, one of them tumbled into a deep hole. His groans brought his comrades round him, and as they carried him to the entrance with much stumbling and shouting, Conrad saw that his right leg was dangling helplessly. When the cavern was quiet again, and the boats which had brought the nest collectors had put off from the shore, Conrad ventured from his hiding place. The swiftlets had gathered round the places where their nests had been, and some were already beginning to make new ones. An elder bird followed Conrad out into the open air. Now that he knew the worst, he seemed to have recovered his spirits.
"We shall give our mates a rest," he said, "and make the new nests ourselves. They won't be so clear and white, perhaps, but they will answer our purpose. If those robbers don't come again this season, all may yet be well, for we shall have plenty of time to rear our young. But that is too much to hope. They are seldom satisfied until they have visited our caves the third time. After that we find it hard to build any sort of nest at all. I wonder why they do it."
Conrad knew now that these nests must be the edible nests, considered so great a delicacy by the Chinese. A school friend of his had actually seen some in the British Museum, and at one time his father had told him as much as £300,000 changed hands for edible birds' nests during a single year. The best were worth their weight in silver, and all were valuable. Conrad looked at the despoiled swiftlets with much respect. "I think you're most awfully clever," he said. "How do you make such wonderful nests?"
"How can I tell?" returned the swiftlet simply. "We only make them as nature taught us. We have two little pads or glands the size of our tongues, which swell up during our nesting season, and from these comes the sticky substance that is seen on our beaks in little threads. We weave them backwards and forwards, and in and out, until our nests are made. And that is all. No one knows what this substance is made of, nor whether we get it by eating fishbone, or from the juices of plants. But it answers our purpose, and if men would but leave us in peace, we should have nothing else to wish for."
When Conrad questioned him about the fair White Merle, he shook his head.
"In the islands of Aru, there are birds that belonged to a garden of paradise. Perhaps she too is there."
"Let us go and see," entreated Gladheart, who had found out by some means that the dreadful orangutan lurked in the forests of Borneo as well as in Sumatra. He was in such distress at the thought of meeting him that Conrad had no heart to remain another moment. Gladheart did not breathe freely until they were far out to sea.